Welcome to Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. Legal issues simplified through real client stories and real-world experiences. Creating simplicity in 3, 2, 1.
Welcome back to another episode of Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. I'm your host, ByrdAdatto, with my co-host, Michael Byrd.
As a business and healthcare law firm, we meet a lot of interesting people and learn their amazing stories. This season's theme is Hard Conversations. We'll take real client stories, of course we'll scrub the names, and build these stories around confronting and having hard conversations. Now, Brad, they don't all have great outcomes, but there are plenty of teachable moments.
You know, Michael, it just occurred to me, you and I often have to have lots of hard conversations with our wife and spouse because we end up traveling a lot. so it's always go over really well. You're leaving again? And so for that, we get to travel a lot, Michael. And, I'm just curious, have you ever left a hotel and hours or even days later, you realize you left something behind?
Well, it's a loaded question, Brad, because you know the answer to this because you experienced what I know you want me to talk about, which is a infamous trip to Shreveport a few years ago. Well, It's been probably 8 years ago, but yes, Brad, you and I drove to Shreveport to give a lecture.
Yeah.
And we were entertained by our host that night, very late into the evening. This is in our younger years, so we were a little bit more spry than we are these days.
Sure.
And I did not feel great the next day.
No, you didn't.
And so, but we still needed to get back to the office, packed up, got in the car, and got about halfway back to Dallas, and I realized that I left my suit and my shoes and my shirt and a couple other things in the hotel room. My belt, yes.
The nice stuff.
Yeah. And so we faced the dilemma. Do we turn around and go back and get it?
Context, audience. We're halfway through a 5-hour drive, I think, a 4-hour drive.
Yeah. It was a very small dilemma because we were like, no, we're going. We're going. And thankfully, the hotel was very gracious, and not too long later, I got a big shipment to the office with a bunch of my clothes.
Yes, so very proud moment for you. I was when I was asking that question, I knew the audience is probably begging for me to have a great story about what I left behind in a hotel, and I actually don't have one. In fact, this morning when I was preparing for the podcast, I asked my wife, I was like, she's known me for 30 years. And I said, can you think of any time I've left something behind in a hotel? She's like, no, not really. And she's like, but what about the time you left your iPhone in the car? I was like, oh, yeah, that one was pretty bad. And so, audience members, I was in Chicago. I had left the Chicago office, going to the airport, and I was on a conference call. So I had my earbuds in and just sitting there chatting. And I put my phone on top of my backpack. And I had already told the driver I had to get on a conference call, so he knew. I pulled up. The driver was very kind. He got out, get my bag, and stuck it curbside. I waved at him, grabbed my backpack, got into the airport, and I stood to the side so I could keep talking without having to hang up. And as I was talking, they started kind of breaking up on me a little bit. And then all of a sudden, they weren't there. And that's when I realized I'd left my phone in the car. Oof. And I did the whole airport scene where I'm chasing with my bag, trying to run after the car as it peels off. And I was like, oh, God. So then I ran to find a payphone. Audience members, payphones don't exist. They do. You just got to really dive deep. And I tried to call the office because they had luckily got the car service for me. I tried to call my wife to see if she could track my phone. I mean, the number of different phone calls I made off the payphone was pretty high and pretty crazy. Eventually, via the FaceTiming on my iPad, I was able to get a hold of some people. And believe it or not, audience members, the driver, as he drove off, heard talking in the back seat and came back around. And the whole 30 minutes I spent trying to find the driver, he was out front. So I did get my iPhone back. So more of the story is, luckily we had a good driver. But, Michael, that made me think on the flight home, you and I had recently, we've been on some trips recently, and I just happened to read this article about items left behind. And it's funny, listening members in this article, items left behind in hotels, and from the article kind of covers stuff from all around the world. And, the typical things, books and laptop chargers and phone chargers and sometimes clothing items, Michael Byrd.
Mm-hmm.
However, this article really noted some strange things that hotel maids found.
Brad, I'm not going to say what my 13-year-old brain is wanting to speculate right now as to what items are left behind. And I know you are giggling on the inside too. So please know that when you share the list that I may not be able to handle it. So I hope you've kind of culled through it.
Yes. Well, and I have little faith in your 13-year-old brain because just like you, I'm probably going the same places. But here, audience member, here are some items that were left behind. A bucket of snails were left behind in a hotel in Budapest. The note said cats everywhere, and a $100 tip with a note that said, "Thanks for taking care of these guys. Be back in a week." The guests never came back.
That was not me, but it could have been.
Yes,
not a cat person.
True. In Washington, D.C., a live snake was found just chilling out in this guest room, and apparently was very large.
Oh.
At another, this was actually in Arizona, a police officer neglected to take his gun and badge.
That's not surprising that has happened.
Yes. A man once left his wife behind in a Prague hotel.
That probably didn't turn out too well.
No. And another man forgot his mom and left without her.
Oh, my goodness.
So here are a few more funny ones that I thought would really juice our audience up. A dead alligator in a hotel room.
As one does.
A goat dressed as Abraham Lincoln.
What does that even mean? Like, what does it have a top hat?
I don't know. I wasn't there. A suitcase full of prosthetic legs.
Okay, no dad jokes, Brad.
It's so hard. A land deed entitled to land in the Scottish Highlands.
Okay.
6 full-size, fully decorated Christmas trees.
That had to be a practical joke.
A hot pocket in the safe with a note that said, "Microwave broken."
I think someone was really angry that their hot pocket was not hot.
A glass eye and a glass of water.
Again, no dad jokes of what they didn't see.
All the room furniture nailed to the ceiling. And I guess technically they left behind nails. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that kind of reminds me of an incident I had in college where the joke played on me.
And finally, last but certainly not least, a Shetland pony.
Okay, well, it was relatively clean, so I'm thankful for that. I am curious, Brad, what this has to do with today's conversation and today's hard conversation.
Well, as our audience members may have heard, Michael, you and I just got back from Las Vegas, where we recorded our first live show in Las Vegas at the 2023 Med Spa show at the Wynn Hotel. And Michael, I think I left it all in the field during that live show.
Oh man, you've got too much going on here, metaphor-wise, Brad. Generally, you leave it all on the field or a court for a sports event. I don't know that you're actually leaving anything behind during a podcast episode. But I like your belief in yourself, but let's get on with today's show.
All right, Michael. Our client in the story starts with 3 dermatologists. And they started their own private practice, and we'll call them by their first names, Hickory, Dickory, and Doc.
Why, Brad? Why?
Well, we've all heard the nursery rhyme about 3 blind mice. And when I was thinking about the story, it kind of reminded me of the 3 blind mice. However, if you know the nursery rhyme, the mice have no name, which led me to the next nursery rhyme about a mouse running up a clock. And the rest is history.
Well, now I have a little bit too much insight into your brain. And there was a comedian from our young adulthood who ruined this nursery rhyme for me, so I'm hoping that your story with these names will restore it. No pressure, but let's kind of reprogram my brain with Hickory, Dickory, and Doc.
Yeah, and no connection, by the way. So Hickory, Dickory, and Doc had known each other for since actually we were residents and were around the same age. Doc was just a few years older, and each had practiced at another dermatology practice before they decided to start their own clinic, which we'll call HDD Dermatology. They decided to jump quickly and form a medical practice, and they were all equal owners, and they were all serving the board of HED to manage it.
I hear the word jump quickly in quotes and thinking this can't be good.
Well, you might get a gold star from Riley with that kind of good insight there, Michael. When the dermatologist practice opened, Hickory, Dickory, and Doc were the actually only medical providers, and they had a small staff. to help book the patients.
And this sounds pretty typical for a small practice startup.
Yeah, so let's fast forward to 10 years, and HDD dermatology grew at a steady pace at adding other staff and medical providers. By year 10, they actually added 2 other partners. Both these partners were non-voting owners.
Okay, again, not that uncommon, and you'll hear, especially as practices scale and they have multiple owners, one way that they'll try to keep some sort of centralized voice on decision-making is through having voting and non-voting shares. So someone may be an owner or a partner, but they don't have a seat at the table, so to speak, on making decisions directionally for the business.
Yeah. Sometimes you might hear that they're just pure equity owner or something like that.
Yeah.
All right. Around the same time, HDD dermatology started adding cash-based services for like injectables, like toxins and dermal filters, and that quickly gained traction. Their patients started asking about other elective services like body contouring. Sometimes you might hear cool sculpting or even fractional resurfacing like halo and other full ablative laser-like services.
Again, this is common with dermatology practice to, at some point, add elective aesthetic services. There's a huge draw in medicine whenever cash-based services can be offered and physicians don't have to deal with the headache of working with insurance.
Yeah, fair assessment. Now, with this new flow of cash paying patients, all the partners started to increase their take-home pay because they had cash-paying patients. And Dickory and Dock thought it'd be a great time to really expand the practice by increasing the square footage of the practice. And with the space, they would solely focus on this new space, more elective, like med spa-like services to capture this new revenue source. And even the 2 non-voting members also agreed that was a good idea.
Well, so though irrelevant because they're non-voting, it is a voice and kind of some momentum on directionally where people want to go with the business. But I noticed that you didn't mention one person, Hickory.
Wow, Riley, put another gold star on Michael's chart for paying attention. Correct, Michael. Dickory and Dock were ready to scale this elective practice for HDD dermatology, but by taking on that more space and hiring more employees. But Hickory just did not want to grow the practice.
Is this where there was a hard conversation?
Hold on, we're not done. As I mentioned in the start of the story, Hickory, Dickory, and Dock were all equal owners and board members, and the company agreement they had put together provided that all decisions of the board must be unanimous.
I call this the ride or die strategy. The owners either all solve a problem together or it doesn't happen. This is somewhat common with 2-owner practices, but it starts getting unusual for obvious reasons when you have 3+ person practice.
Yeah, and you'll see as it plays. For months, Hickory would not budge and noted that unless she agreed, they could not move forward without taking on this extra space or hiring these new employees. And as you can imagine, audience members, this put massive strain in the relationship between all the owners, including the non-voting owners.
Well, was Hickory concerned with having to execute a personal guarantee on the new space or have some other concern like the cost of hiring these new employees?
No, actually, that's a good question. The new space was actually that they were going to acquire because they had been in the space for so long. They were going to actually just go, next door, basically. It was not requiring a personal guarantee. And the other owners had already worked through the business plan, most of which was going to be managed actually by Dickory and Dock. So Hickory wasn't even had to be that involved in it. But it actually started getting extremely unhealthy relationship between the parties. Dickory and Dock and the other non-voting members actually started to meet without Hickory on how to continue forward with this new space. They would then meet with Hickory to present why they had to move forward with this new space and how this new space was not within. The problem was for Hickory, this new space really wasn't in her vision of the practice, and so she was just against it.
And I'll just note that it's relatively common, but always an unhealthy sign when you start to have meetings before the meetings, and it's a good warning sign that there may be trouble in the relationship that needs to be dealt with.
Yeah, and Michael, it actually started getting worse. They actually reached out to litigation counsel on how could they force Hickory to move forward.
Well, I'm going to state the obvious and say that if you contact a litigation attorney, that's that's not good.
Yeah. So they even spoke with us, and this is where we kind of came into the picture with starting a new separate med spa in which Dickory, Doc, and the other non-voting members would be the sole owners of it. And that actually, and when we learned more about them, we started discussing their fiduciary duties owed by the board members to their current practice.
And I think we have a vocabulary word there, Brad, Mr. Fancy. For those that don't know, if you're on a board of a company or a practice, you have what's called a fiduciary duty. It's a duty of loyalty and care to the company. And so this means that you have to put the interest of the company ahead of your own. And so you hear the term, fiduciary duties. And so you have to be really careful if you are serving in that capacity and have this fiduciary duty and you want to go and start doing something that, competes with or is not in the best interest of the company.
Yeah, and this is when it kind of started spiraling a little bit because the conversations were, well, we'll just break up the company, or we're just going to do it anyway and violate the terms, or we don't really care about fiduciary duties. And honestly, it's just kind of when they started getting into an impasse.
So what happened? Did they have the hard conversation with Hickory, or did they kind of go the avoidance strategy?
Dun, dun, dun. They actually put on their big girl pants, and they actually ended up having a hard conversation with each other as to what to do with their dermatology practice. All the owners, including our firm, actually sat down, and we had a very, very long whiteboard meeting. Honestly, Michael, it felt more like a mediation than an actual meeting. But at this meeting, they asked us to lay out the facts, and so we gave them all their options as we saw it based on their current governing documents, and then other things they could do, such as keep everything the same, status quo, or they can modify the current company agreement by changing the process in which people would have to prove certain things, all the way to dissolving the entity and starting over.
Well, I'll first just note that this sounds like just such a great example of actually sitting down and talking about something hard can really help de-escalate a situation, which is awesome. But you mentioned approval process. For our audience, we're kind of discussing voting actions, and I think we should give the audience some examples of what we're talking about here.
Yeah, and voting actions are all over the place, and it's about approving an action of the entity, and that's what the boards typically do. So in this particular case, it could be approving opening and maintaining a bank account, or establishing a committee, or delegating what power that committee have, or adding new owners, or selling the entire business. And each such action could require a majority approval or a supermajority approval, or sometimes a unanimous approval.
All right. Well, there's a lot you just said. Brad, I think we should go to break. And then on the other side, let's kind of break down some of the differences between these different decisions making, kind of approaches, and learn some lessons from HDD dermatology. And I'm curious to hear what happened after the hard conversation.
Many business owners use legal counsel as a last resort rather than as a proactive tool that can further their success. Why? For most, it's the fear of unknown legal costs. ByrdAdatto's Access Plus program makes it possible for you to get the ongoing legal assistance you need for one predictable monthly fee. That gives you unlimited phone and email access to the legal team, so you can receive feedback on legal concerns as they arise. Access Plus, a smarter, simpler way to access legal services. Find out more. Visit ByrdAdatto.com today.
Welcome back to Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. I'm your host, ByrdAdatto, with my co-host, Michael Byrd. Now, Michael, this season our theme is hard conversations. And HDD dermatology, they had to have a hard conversation on control of that practice.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, if we kind of reset the story a little bit, we have, three doctors who are friends. They start their practice together. At the beginning, it's just a small deal, and they're, they kind of default into what I call the ride or die strategy, but it was basically like, hey, we're in this together and we're going to figure things out. Mm-hmm. And so, we'll make decisions together. And, what's hard with the ride or die strategy is that it puts pressure on making decisions, and what they confronted here is the business started to evolve and in a way that they probably didn't dream.
Yeah.
They didn't probably anticipate the aesthetic, kind of aspect to their revenue stream that they were going to add. They started getting some momentum with this kind of cash-based revenue stream. And so there was a disconnect, and it put pressure on the relationship, so much so that they started taking some unhealthy actions like secret meetings and talking to a litigator to figure out all these worst-case scenarios. But ultimately, thankfully, with you playing mediator / whiteboard leader, they had a meeting, and they engaged in it and talked about it. And it at least sounded like where we left off in the story that things took a turn for the better. But, we really just left off with kind of the different ways you can solve for decision making. So let's pause and kind of talk about some of the legal issues that have been raised. I know that we speak with a lot of people buying into a business, and often they don't think about what happens on the kind of decision-making side of it or the control side of it after the fact.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Michael. And we've discussed this tool that we use. We often call it the 4 C's. But again, for our audience members who might be hearing this for the very first time, what are the 4 C's?
Yeah, so broadly, you have cost, compensation, control, and contingencies. And our prior 2 episodes kind of focused in on the cost and compensation elements, and today we're talking about control, and ultimately what we're talking about is decision making.
Yep. Yeah, that's right. So today's story really is focused on decision making. And as a reminder, the thrill of starting a practice can be intoxicating. I mean, you're starting up a business that allows you to, as a physician, to own something that's yours, and there are these key individuals who are there on your side. You're launching a brand and all these great ideas. However, just because you're an owner doesn't mean you actually have control over the day-to-day running of that business. And these powers are generally left to the board of directors, and in this case, in our story, the board of managers.
Yeah, and it's probably helpful to think about the typical. We've talked about this in the past, that people wear different hats, and ultimately, when 3 people start a business, they at a minimum have 2 hats. This is probably what they had in this story. You would know for sure, but they had their hat as the owners of the business. And assuming they were equal owners, they had that. And then they had their hat as the board of managers. This is, in a traditional corporation, think about the board of directors, and the board of managers, kind of philosophically works at the pleasure of the ownership group. And then a lot of times when you set up the infrastructure, the board of managers will delegate day-to-day decisions to the officers. And so within this infrastructure, it's important to kind of think through and plan out, how are you going to have checks and balances on who can make what decisions and who has kind of the ultimate say-so. But a shortcut around that is what they did, which is to say, we're all going to agree or not.
Yeah. Well, Michael, in this story, we actually started to discuss, what should be required of the owners. And other times we will talk with our clients about majority approval or supermajority approval or unanimous approval. And maybe for our audience members who just, think they understand what that means, but could you clarify a little bit what's the difference between these different types of approvals?
Yeah, so there are kind of levels of participation by the people that have a decision on some decisions. So a more routine decision might be a majority approval, which is, oftentimes if there's, 3 people on the board, 2 people or 51% would be enough to get a majority, or you can actually base it on your percentage of ownership in the vote. A supermajority is a higher level. So let's say you had 4 people that were on the board. It might take 3 of those 4 people to pass that decision. So it's a much bigger decision.
Right.
And then, of course, unanimous is what these had, and that's everyone has to make that decision. And so you may actually delegate some basic decisions like who's going to buy the staples or pay the bills or deposit checks and the functions of running a business to someone that probably is an officer and has a fiduciary duty that we talked about to do these things so that you're not having to have a vote every time. And then you can get to the board level where you have some bigger decisions. And then a lot of times you'll put the really, really big decisions back on the owners to say, hey, if we're going to sell the company or something big like that, then this needs to be an ownership vote.
Yeah. And, a lot of times we have people who, they have unanimous, and you've heard me talk about this before. I'm just not a fan of any organization having unanimous requirements. And even in the case you referenced, or sometimes even two people, they'll just have a unanimous agreement because they can't move forward. Well, one of the reasons I don't like the audience members is often the case is you have a unanimous clause in there, and then you add a second, third, and fourth person, and you just forgot that approval is unanimous. And unfortunately, I've seen this not work many, many times. And I've even had groups tell us, oh, yeah, we're all the founders, and if we don't agree to it, and it's not unanimous, we're not going to move forward. And unfortunately, as the groups get bigger, I've seen this crush groups as they add younger owners or people don't have the same philosophy that they have. And an example I'll give real quick, and this is just another aside, a story that I had, which was a fairly large orthopedic practice. The founders had unanimous for everything that the board had to decide, basically. And as they grew, unfortunately, they had this younger orthopedic physician who had extremely abusive behavior towards their practice staff and the hospital staff. He'd been warned multiple times by the senior doctors, hey, get your act together. You cannot behave this way. What all came crashing down when the main hospital that they were affiliated with kicked him off the staff. So now he couldn't go operate at the main hospital, and you still had staff complaining. So that the physician's like, well, we need to get rid of him. Well, fast forward to the board. The board had one of the younger docs on it who, guess what? His best friend was that doctor who he helped recruit to that group. He's like, I'm not going to vote against him. And they spent tons of time trying to convince this doc they needed to get rid of him. And he refused to and said, you can't let me kick him out because it has to be unanimous. And so that was a time in which litigation did eventually come about because they had that unanimous approval. And if they had a simple majority or even a super majority, that guy could have still voted against it and said, hey, buddy, I try to protect you, but they outvoted me. And so it's just another demonstration of why you have to really protect yourself as an organization and not get locked in on a unanimous.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great illustration of the risk with unanimous. I personally don't have as strong of an aversion to the ride or die strategy when there's two owners involved. And it really starts with this, just acknowledging that when you have two people, there's no kind of glamorous or smooth choice. Yeah. You either have to both agree or pick someone who's going to be the decision maker, or my least favorite is have some outsider break a tie.
Yeah.
And so I like it if, there's a way that you can have, okay, the final choice is so-and-so's, because you're going to avoid these scenarios like you just described in your a moment ago. But a lot of times they're equal coming into it. And if I sense that they have a good relationship and there's good communication, we'll talk about it, and we'll talk about these scenarios if they go ride or die on their decision making and understand the risk they're putting on the business. But ultimately, they're betting on each other to solve things. And to your point, if they add another owner, they've got to change that, because then the risk skyrockets. But in any event, whether you do it or you don't do it, the risk is great, and so it requires a lot of thought and conversation before you set up your decision making. I'm curious what happened between Hickory Dickory and Doc.
So after that whiteboard meeting, it actually started progressing. We had a few more calls and meetings, but it was all progressing because they had that hard conversation. And eventually Hickory Dickory and Doc did agree that they needed to modify the agreement. And and they realized that this was not an easy pass for any of these founding members, but they certainly decided that certain business decisions like buying equipment or hiring more employees or adding more space, if 51% of the people really agreed, they would go forward with that. But then they said, well, if it's a substantial decision like a personal guarantee or selling all the business or something like that, then they would agree that 75% or a supermajority would require that approval. So finally, the other thing they actually did was they actually added the other non-voting members to become voting members. There's a lot of things happening in that organization. Believe it or not, Hickory eventually accepted that, if with that supermajority approval, that she would be okay with those results. And fast forward to present day, the practice is booming. Hickory is still an owner, and audience members, believe it or not, this week we just added a new owner to the practice. And so all is good. Michael, I think we're almost out of time. So what is your final takeaway?
Well, I think the way that one would leave a crocodile in their hotel room is they're in a hurry and they don't slow down. And I think the similar thing that we saw in today's story and you see with people that are starting a practice is the fast way to deal with decision making is just to go with this default ride or die strategy. Everyone has to approve or not. And if they would just slow down and think about, kind of the variables and the vision for how they want to run the organization, they would probably come up with a better solution on how decision making could happen, especially when you have three people. And going back to it, they would have run back to the room and grabbed that dead crocodile and not left it behind.
Maybe not. Well, audience members, next Wednesday's show, we have a special, our first live podcast from the 2023 Medical Spa shows, and it's to be Spotting the Legal Red Flags. It will be released, and audience members, it's good. It's a lot of fun. We got audience interaction, audience questions, and everyone in the audience saw that I was better than Michael. Thanks again for joining us today. And remember, if you like this episode, please subscribe. Make sure to give us a 5-star rating and share with your friends.
You can also sign up for the ByrdAdatto newsletter by going to our website at ByrdAdatto.com.
ByrdAdatto is providing this podcast as a public service. This podcast is for educational purposes only. This podcast does not constitute legal advice, nor does it establish an attorney-client relationship. Reference to any specific product or entity does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by ByrdAdatto. The views expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Please consult with an attorney on your legal issues.